Hi and welcome back to day 7 of the Augusta video sew along. Today we'll start by attaching the yoke using the burrito method. This method has a bit of a reputation for being confusing and resulting in things being sewn the wrong way around, but with my foolproof instructions you'll sew a perfect burrito yoke every time. After our yoke is attached, we'll quickly sew up the side seams, and that will be it for today's lesson. To attach your yoke, you're going to need your front, your back, and your 2 yoke pieces. Set the front aside and grab one of your yokes. Alright, so we're going to start by attaching our inner yoke. So to do that, we're going to flip our back over so the wrong side is facing up. And then when this is finished, we want the right side of the inner yoke facing out. So to do that, you're going to align the yoke with the right side facing the wrong side of the back. Now, if you didn't mark the center of your yoke while cutting, it can be helpful to do that now. So you just fold it in half and make a little notch in the center back, and that will align with the center back of the back piece. So we're just going to pin the center back. We're going to pin the edges. And then I like to put 2 pins on either side. Now we're going to head over to the machine and we're going to sew along this yoke seam within the seam allowance. So I use a 1/4 inch seam allowance. You can baste it along the seam line, but you'll need to take that out later, and sometimes if your needle goes through the basting thread when you're doing your final line, it can be really hard to take that out. So I solved that by just sewing within the seam allowance. So let's head over to the machine and do that. Alright, so here we are at the machine. And you don't need to back tack for this seam because it's not a final seam. Just sew along the yoke seam. Make sure you remove your pins as you get to them. And then head back over to the table. Now we need to attach our outer yoke. So turn your back so the right side is facing up. Take your other yoke, and for this one, since we want it, obviously the right sides of both to be facing out, we're going to align it so the right side of the yoke is facing the right side of the back. Again, if you didn't cut a notch at the center back, that's helpful here. We're going to again align along the yoke seam. Then we're going to head back over to the machine and stitch along the yoke seam along our 1/2 inch seam line. So you're just going to stitch from one side to the other through all layers. So let's go do that now. All right, right, now this is the final seam, so I do back tack here. You can see I'm using my 1/2 inch seam allowance. Back tack at the other side. And that's it. We now need to grade our seam allowance. So to do that, we're going to cut the outer yoke seam allowance down to 1/8 of an inch. All right, there you can see, trim down. Then the seam allowance of the back, we're going to just cut that in half. Here you can see we have that graded down. And for the seam allowance of the inner yoke, we're going to leave that at full length. I now like to take a moment to press the yokes away from the body. So I start with the outer yoke, and I do this on a ham because this is a curved seam. Just move the ham across as you work, and make sure the back yoke is laying flat. We want to avoid pressing wrinkles into it if possible. And don't worry if you're pressing the pleat a tiny bit, it's not a big deal. It'll end up being pressed as you wear it. All right, now I flip my garment over, again with the ham, and we're just going to press the inner yoke up. Again, move the ham across as you work. Don't worry too much about the pleat. And again, make sure the yoke to the bottom is laying flat. It should be because we pressed it, but you never know what happens. So our yoke is now pressed up. Here's the inside and the outside. Lay your back out so the wrong side is facing up. Then the outer yoke, you're going to fold it down to get it out of the way. So we only have one layer of yoke right here. It's the inner yoke. Now grab your front and lay it right side up. Now, an easy way to double check to make sure you have things the right way is that if you were going to put this on right now, your body would go in and it would be touching the two wrong sides and the right sides would be facing out. So that's just an easy way to make sure you have things the right way around. Now, pin your shoulder seams. And then we're going to head over to the machine, and once again we're just going to stitch along these seam lines within the seam allowance. So I use a 1/4 inch seam allowance to do this. All right. Again, no need to back tack here. This is not a final seam. Clip your threads, and I chained these two, so I'm going to cut them apart and then head back over to the table. All right, now it's time for the fun magic burrito part. Lay your garment out with the front, right side of the front facing up, and make sure the outer yoke is still folded down towards the hem. We're now going to take the back and the front and just roll it up. And you see the lower yoke is revealed. Now what we're going to do to make the burrito is fold the yokes together and pin the shoulder seams. And you can see naturally the right sides are together. Now we're going to head over to our machine and we're going to sew the final seam for the yoke. So we're going to use our 1/2 inch seam allowance and sew along both. Okay, so here we go with our 1/2 inch seam allowance. We are going to back tack here, or whatever back tack alternative you like to use, and just sew across. Now I do clip these. It's a little hard to chain those two because you have all this bulk here. So then go over to the other side. And that's it. I'm going to head back over to the table. All right, now that that's sewn, we're going to once again grade our seam allowance. So the upper yoke, going to grade that down to 1/8 of an inch on both shoulders. So then the body, the front, we're going to grade that to 1/4 of an inch. So we're just cutting that in half. And then again for the other shoulder. All right, and then the outer yoke, we're just leaving that full length. So now here comes the fun part. We're going to unfurl the shirt through the neck. Do this carefully. You don't want to stretch things out, but you're just gonna put the garment through the neckline and then untangle it. And here you can see we have a yoke. Now we need to press these seam lines. Now I press these on a sleeve roll just because it can be hard due to the dart and the angle of the shoulder to press flat here. This just helps kind of release any tension. So start with the outer yoke. So press that away. Then do the other shoulder. Now we're going to flip it over and press the inner yoke. That's nice and flat, and then move over to the other one. Okay, so our yoke is sewn, and there's one final step. We have here 2 loose layers at the neckline and the shoulder seams. So we want to stitch within the seam allowance to anchor those 2 together. So I just put a few pins in to keep things aligned. You don't want this moving around. Make sure your shoulders are aligned. And then this side as well. And then we'll head over to the machine to do this step. All right, now I just stitch again with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. That way it's in the seam line. There's no need to back tack on this. We just want to anchor these together. Then I do the other shoulder. And then we're going to slide our shirt under the foot and sew along the inside neck. and head back over to the table. All right, our yoke is now complete. Here we have the front and the back. And we're just going to do one final thing before we end this lesson. We're going to sew up our side seams. All right, so we have the right sides facing each other. We're going to align the side seam. So start at the underarm seam, pin those together, and then lower down we have these two match points, and that's where we're going to stop sewing for the side split. So we want to align those. And then just align the rest of the side seam. Then we're going to head over to our machine and we're going to sew a 1/2 inch seam allowance from the top down, stopping at the match point. All right, so here we are. We're going to back tack. And sew down. You're going to stop at the match point, and I do a little back tack. Then head back over to the table. All right, so here our side seam is sewn, and we'll be pressing the seam allowance of the side seam to the back, but we're going to need to eventually have these side splits press open. So because of that, we're going to need to clip into our seam line. And you can see I followed the angle of this edge up and clip to, but not through the seam line. Now we need to finish this edge, which I do by serging. So I'll do that now. All right, so I have my seam line aligned with my 1/2 inch marker on my serger. And I'm just going to sew to the bottom. And you can see here this extra for the mitered corner. We just fold that out of the way and sew to the lower edge. Now here you can see how this allows the mitered edge to fold open and the seam allowance folds towards the back. So we are going to press that. Towards the back of the garment. And don't worry about pressing this lower edge yet. We'll just leave that. So you're going to repeat this for the other side, and that's it for today. So that's it for today. See, the yoke wasn't hard at all, and we now have something we can try on. In our next lesson, we'll be sewing up the short sleeve, so stay tuned for that. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments below, and make sure you subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any of our video lessons. Have a great day, and I'll see you back here next time. Bye.